Hey folks, welcome to this session in the flow-flavored MVPDays virtual conference. My name is Paul Culmsee and I'm here to talk about a real-world case study that I think demonstrates that Flow really is a pretty serious enabling product now. And so the intent here is to hopefully demonstrate to you, if you have any lingering doubts and you think, oh, I'm not sure if Flow is ready for the prime time, I think this case study will show you a good example of leveraging its strengths and using it to enhance the value proposition of SharePoint, PowerApps, and Microsoft Teams at the same time. So, who am I? I am a management consultant and I do technology as well. And this case study was actually started out me doing management consulting work, but I ended up doing technology work. And this is the one that really, I guess, proved to me the power tools of PowerApps, Flow, Power BI are really amazing at being able to deliver incredibly high value at low cost. I'm also an author. I've written a couple of books. The books are not to do with technology directly. They're actually more to do with my adventures in management consulting, facilitation, and complex problem solving, which is the third point, wicked problem specialist. So if you've not heard of the term wicked problem, go look it up on Wikipedia. That's basically what I do. And I also do a lot of training and mentoring for, I guess, citizen developers, people who work in the business who want to leverage the power tools to develop solutions without going through the traditional IT development lifecycle. I am a business applications MVP, and so I guess let's get into the case study. Here's the background. This is a picture of a railway crossing in Japan. It's called a level crossing because it's all at the same level. And you've got a train going past and you can see there are cars and bikes and pedestrians all walking around. Now the problem with this is, notwithstanding the noise, the fact that it's quite dangerous, there's a lot of congestion and the whole area suffers from this, it's not a particularly nice area. Now, what this project is doing, this is an Australian project that aims to actually improve situations like this, and it is upgrading or removing 50 dangerous and congested level crossings, and in the process upgrading or constructing more than 20 new train stations. Now, there's a lot of money involved in this. This is a multi-billion dollar project happening over about 5 years. This is an example, I guess, of what the result is. You can see here that the road is now separate from the rail network, which means you eliminate the congestion problem. But also through really good urban design, you can make the area look nice, feel good, and just activate the whole area, bring the area to life. And so that is the intent of this project. Now, you might be wondering, this is a construction project, why am I involved in this? Well, the reason is the leadership of this particular project or this program of work, the organization, had a very big focus on what they call learning organization. And I was originally engaged to develop a knowledge management strategy for safety. Once that strategy was done and the framework was built, we then switched modes to delivering solutions. And so that brings us to where we are today. Here is, I guess, some context on the challenges of doing this in a project like this, capturing knowledge, capturing lessons, and distributing that wisdom to the rest of the organization. Here's the first challenge. What I just showed you in the previous picture of those railway stations, there's 50 of them, and they are distributed across quite a wide geographic area. And not only are there a lot, there are actually so many that no one organization can do the work. So they had to engage multiple organizations to get this done. So that means you've got different employees, different standards, different practices, different internal methodologies, a lot of variation in the organizations. You can imagine that lessons from one project could be really valuable to the others, but very hard to capture and disseminate that info. The second challenge is more of a general one. The simple fact is traditional approaches to knowledge management, and in particular lessons learned, really suck. I don't know if you've been involved in a lessons learned exercise. A lot of people have, and it typically involves filling out some spreadsheet or some document and putting a whole bunch of what you think the lessons are. I don't know about you, but I would consider that lesson captured, but that does not mean lesson learned. So not only does it lose a lot of rich context, it actually takes ages to do, if it's done at all, but then it goes off into a filing system, never to be seen again. And it's very rare that organizations actually go back and revisit this stuff, right? And the other challenge is just got to remember who are our users here. You are dealing with people who are on construction sites. They're very time poor. They rarely get access to a PC, or at least the majority of staff, and they typically will use devices like the guy in the picture here. So they're your three big challenges. In relation to what our strategy was, there were basically four pillars to knowledge management in this organization. One was communities of practice, one was finding expertise, one was the documents, the process, the procedures, and all of the content, and one was capturing the insights and lessons. So they were kind of the four pillars that we were trying to bring together with the solution. So now I'm going to take you through a bit of a scenario, and then we're going to actually do a demo of this thing. So I want you to imagine this story. A frontline worker sees something that has safety implications, or sees some really good behavior, or even has a bit of a thought bubble or a flash of inspiration. So they can take out their phone and basically, using a Power App, they can share an observation or a good practice. They can put some details about that. And the intent here is rapid capture. We're not asking people to fill in an elaborate spreadsheet. This is all about quickly grab it, capture some photos, capture some media, and basically get that observation down while it's fresh in their mind. That then is shared to a program-wide feed. And so this means that every other person on any of those 50 different sites that I mentioned earlier can actually now consume this, much like an activity feed in Facebook or LinkedIn, except it's specifically related to this program of work and enables different sites to be able to get insights from what's happening on other sites. So if you can imagine, at the start of the day, they might have a bit of a safety moment or some sort of pre-planning session, and now it's actually informed by things that are happening all around the program of work. Now, what also can happen when people capture expertise, it might be an insight, but it may not be a lesson. And so what then happens is all of those insights are posted to Teams, to Microsoft Teams communities, and we have communities of practice for different roles and different disciplines that span across all of those different construction sites. So this now starts to decide, is this really a lesson? What can we take away from this? Do we have to change something? And so I guess that then leads to this bit where the net result of that could be updating documentation. We update a standard, we might update a policy, we might revise a process, we might actually revise our onboarding material so that the issue or opportunity or lesson is not lost. And so this is where you get into the world of codified documents, the stuff that ends up in document libraries. And finally, those documents that are updated are also shared back to this feed and available from the devices so that the mobile workforce can consume them and absorb them really quickly. So the diffusion of this new insight is taken care of. So let's take a look at this, shall we? Okay, so here is the app just in the PowerApps Studio editor for simplicity. And you can see that the first thing actually is we happen to have an alert. So it is possible for the administrators to send program-wide alerts out for everyone so they can quickly read. What we're going to do is close that for now and just have a look at this feed. So all items in the feed, either insights or document uploads or tweets and stuff like that, come through into an integrated feed, including rich media, and users can then like, and we can then find out which items are popular. So you can see here's an example of some feed items that have been shared, including new documents that have been uploaded. If we actually either clicking share to feed or through the menu, you can share something this way or join a team discussion. But if we share to the feed, we click this screen and it opens up a screen where we can say, okay, hey, I'd like to share, say, a good practice. You can type some content in, you can take a photograph. Let's use a cat. So we have a photograph, and even photographs can be have comments put into them. And you can basically put additional comments in. You can see the weather data or location and weather information. You can tag that against an individual photo. So then you get to pick your audience. Who are we going to share this thing with? And so that's when you say, cool, I'd like to share it with these audiences. So I'm thinking these guys. And so we tag the audience. And then we can go, cool, that's our audience done. Where would this fit into? What part of the work breakdown or the work is it? And you can come in here and you can go, okay, I am thinking that this is related to demolition, cranes, emergency and excavation. Okay, and then having said that, the final thing really is where we get to say, you know something, I'm also going to post this to the discussion board. So by turning this on, this is what will go to Teams. And you can add hyperlinks as well if you wish to. So I'm not going to share this, but just to show you what this looks like in Teams, we'll quickly switch over. So now you can see here in Teams, here is that very same post that's now been shared from the field as a good practice. So all of that same information that was put in there is actually there available. And someone has liked it as well. So what else can we do here? Well, firstly, we have our ability to go and find an expert. We can click in here and we can basically put some skills in and find people that match those skills. So if we're looking for someone that has some civil works expertise, it will return this. We're also using the WhoBot functionality within Microsoft Teams as well, for those of you that have used that. So more importantly, let's go and have a look at this safety library. Recall that earlier in the discussion, I spoke of how documentation will end up getting updated and modified or enhanced and then shared back to be consumed through the feed. So the safety library also allows users to quickly find and access all of the safety documentation across the program of work. Now, I'll quickly go into preview mode to demonstrate this as it's a little bit easier. So if I click the safety library icon, you are basically looking at a full text search of SharePoint. Now, a user from here, this is just in date order and recency, but they can come in and click filter. I can come in here now and actually get a bit more specific about what I want to see. So a user might see, I want to see all alerts related to confined spaces. And if they apply that filter, it will subsequently load those documents. Similarly, what we might do actually, rather than do something like that, let's go alert and contributed by a certain organization. And we've even got autocomplete. So if I start typing in the letter B, you can see that as I type, it narrows down the selections. And in fact, it automatically, the UI handles it. So if I just click this one here, you can see that the box is dynamically sizing based on what content I put in. So if I go AUS, you can see that now it's this size. And once I choose one, it's now the exact size it needs to be. So I can come up and click an apply filter button here, and it will actually now apply those search settings and come back. And you are now looking at the documents that are classified that way. It shows you that there's been a filter. I could go further, and then maybe if I just put in the word alert, we can also do keyword search with hit highlighting as well. The other thing worth mentioning in this one, these are all looks like PDF results. I wonder if there's a Word document. Here's one. The nice thing is, even if the safety library document is still in Word format, it can still be displayed in PowerApps. Now, natively, as I record this video, PowerApps cannot display Word documents, Excel documents, or native Office documents. It only does PDF. But luckily for us, there is actually an API in SharePoint that allows you to retrieve a document, and it will convert it to a PDF on the fly so it can be displayed inside PowerApps. And in fact, I'm going to elaborate on how that was done in a moment. Now, this is the point where we really turn our attention to Flow, because Flow is actually the key enabling piece of infrastructure that allowed us to develop these kind of solutions. So now let's do a bit of a deeper dive and look at how certain pieces of this functionality were delivered. Now, the crux of the solution is actually using SharePoint. So this is where we utilize the best out of various tools. We're using SharePoint search engine. So behind the scenes, we have a safety library where all documents and resources get uploaded to. Things like tweets and feed data from third parties like safety agencies and information like that comes into a custom list. All the learnings and insights that have been shared by users are stored here. And we also have a list of popular content, which is tracking the likes and stuff like that. So that is configured as a SharePoint results source, and then we basically say to that results source, they're the locations, but we're only interested in list items, documents, and certain columns and metadata. That all gets processed into the SharePoint search engine. From there, it's accessed through a SharePoint search API, and what happens is when the app loads up, you can see here that we have no feed right now. It basically talks to the SharePoint REST API and says, give me the last 50 results. And then back comes that data and it is viewable inside the app. Given that, let's just think about how something gets shared so it appears in that feed. Basically, as per the demo, you remember how a user can come in, tag an observation or a good practice, take a photo, tag an audience, and then choose which community practice it should go to if they wish to share. The way that is done is we are using something called action cards, and action cards enable you to put a much more structured piece of content into tools like Outlook and Teams. In Teams, this is done by an incoming webhook. So we're using Flow to grab the contribution from the user and then send it to an incoming webhook, and then it appears in Teams in the way you can see here, either on the mobile or in the browser. Now, if you've never seen an action card before, you may well have. This is just a sample one from Microsoft. Outlook uses them. And if you've ever seen one of these kind of flow approvals where it says, hey, you've got approval required, and inside the context of the application, here in this case being Outlook, you then basically click approve and it says, cool, you have been approved. Unlike the old days of when you would send a task approval in SharePoint and it would be a link that takes you out of Outlook into SharePoint, now everything is done in the context of the application. So that is the essence of message cards. There is a schema published that actually shows you how to create this format. And so my flow had to build this action card. This is actually what it really looks like behind the scenes, all of this ugly looking JSON. And in fact, this kind of shows you how certain sections map to certain parts of the action card. Fortunately for all of us, there is a website called Message Card Playground that helps you do all the work. So just to quickly take you there, here is the Playground site, and you can do things like there's your schema on the left, here's the actual card on the right, and you can choose different types of cards. So in fact, if you want to know how Microsoft Flow approvals work, you are literally looking at the schema. And here's the flow itself. Just zooming out a bit to give you a bit of context. That's better. You can see that this flow is actually triggered by PowerApps, and PowerApps sends the ID of the new insight or the new piece of content that a user has shared. And the first thing we need to do is use a SharePoint Get Item action that actually goes and grabs the full detail of that particular share so that we can then build the JSON that we need. And we are also using Flow's capability for running parallel tasks. You can see that there are 4 sets of discrete tasks here that are actually running the different parts of building out the action card. The reason I do that is mainly for performance, because all the different sections of the card can all be built at the same time. So why not take advantage of the parallelism ability of Flow to build things out quicker? So this branch here, in fact, what this one does, I'm pretty sure, this is the audience one. Basically, the audience is a term set. It's a managed metadata column, multi-value managed metadata column. So this is a pretty simple piece. All it does is it iterates through every single audience that has been tagged, and we are using an action, a variable action called append string. And what this is basically doing is for each audience, it's building out a comma delimited list of audiences into a string. So the audience coming from SharePoint is actually in an array format by virtue of the fact it's a multi-value field. Same happens with the work activity. This is another SharePoint column and it works in exactly the same way as the previous one. I'm using the append string. So the outcome of these 2 branches is 2 strings. Okay. Now we come across, this is the one that actually handles image thumbnails. And this one's a tricky one to explain because there's some other flow things that I haven't yet covered. But basically the idea is we have a variable for storing image thumbnails, and these are going to be in a URL format. It's a SharePoint API that returns a thumbnail URL. And we also need another variable. And this is one where we use the conditional aspects of Flow, because we only need to deal with photos if photos have actually been included in the original share from someone. So there's a conditional piece of logic here that basically says, hey, if photos have been included, do a whole bunch of work and build out the action card JSON to create the photo. And the final one is related to hyperlinks. And so again, if you haven't done a hyperlink, then you can keep going. But if you have done a hyperlink, there's a bit of extra work to do. The net result of all of this is a single action card variable, which has all of this stuff combined. In fact, if I open this, you can see that it's basically JSON with various chunks of logic that comes from those parallel tasks above. And that finally uses the HTTP action and it posts it to the Microsoft Teams webhook. And there is the body. The body is the action card that came from that variable. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what that flow does. And this diagram kind of recaps what we've just been through to show you how each of the sections of the flow and the branches, the parallel branches, relate to certain sections of the action card. Okay, so another interesting thing that flow really helps with is, in actual fact, the information that is returned by the SharePoint search engine does not include photos. It's just the raw search result data of the tweets, the shares, the documents. So we need to do something about that, and Flow just proves its magic here. It's also worth noting that the same issue happens with the action cards. So I've represented that with, I guess, placeholders on both of them. So the way this flow works is, firstly, I need to find, or I need the ID of the image. Now, fortunately, I've configured SharePoint Search Engine to return that into the feed. PowerApps calls Flow, gives it this item ID. It uses this item ID and goes and finds that image in the media library. Now, we don't want to return the image itself, because what if it's a high-res photo, like an 8 megabyte photo? This feed would take ages to load. So what we do is we call a SharePoint API and we basically say, hey SharePoint, here is an item ID. Can you please give me a thumbnail of this particular size? And SharePoint will return a thumbnail, a URL for you of that thumbnail, a pre-authenticated URL that you then use in PowerApps to actually display the photo. And so it's done really fast. So here's what that one looks like. Okay, so here's the thumbnail handling flow. And I should call out straight away that I'm using a HTTP request and response pattern here. This is a relic of history because you can now do what I'm describing using the standard PowerApps trigger. At the time I did this, you could not return data to PowerApps. You could only send it one way, from PowerApps to Flow, and not the other way. But nevertheless, PowerApps basically calls this flow by sending a post, a HTTP post, to this URL, and it passes in the ID, the list item ID of the share. So basically, if someone shared something, it's the ID of that person's observation or good practice. I then have a variable that extracts that from the query string, so from the HTTP trigger, and that's basically saying, hey, go to the trigger, go to the output section, go to the query section, which is the query string, and look for item ID. I then take this and I go to the media library where all the photos are stored, and I use a SharePoint Get Files action, and I say, okay, please go to the media library, and I only want to see photos that relate to this particular share, which is this piece here, a little piece of OData. And note, I only bring one back. So even if you took 50 photos with that particular share, I'm only going to bring back the first one, because I only show one photo in the high-level activity feed. Now, the interesting thing about this is, even though I'm only asking for one photo, the data still comes back as an array, because note, the action is called the Get Files action. If there were 10 files, it would bring back an array. That means that when we start making use of this down here, there is an apply to each, and all I need out of this data is the list item ID of that photo. But because it comes back as an array, I have this apply to each. That necessitates another little trick. You can't initialize variables inside a loop. You have to initialize a variable outside. So I make the variable called media ID and I make it empty. Okay, so it's completely empty here. And then in here, I actually set it. So even though there's an apply to each, it's only ever going to run once. It's just a quirk of how this is done. You can get around this with expressions and telling it to only return the first record, but that takes us too far afield from here. So by this point, we now have everything we need to know about this particular photo, and we use the send a HTTP request action to basically talk to a SharePoint API, one of my favorite APIs called the Render List Data as Stream API. And we basically pass in that media identifier and a few extra parameters, and among other things, we are going to get back a whole bunch of information which we can construct a URL from. So basically what you're seeing here is me building a URL by using all of the information that comes back from this HTTP request. I then, having built the URL, I save it and send it back to PowerApps. Now, This might seem really conceptual and really kind of freaky, but rest assured it's cool. I have already recorded about a 50-minute video in the flow of the week from November 14, where I go in depth into this particular flow. So I'm not intending to cover this into detail here. Just rest assured that basically at one end, the way this flow works is at the top end, you pass it an ID of the share, and by the back end, it basically says, and here's the first thumbnail for any photos associated with that share. Okay, so here's another flow that I use. This one's a pretty simple one. The feed incorporates information from other sources. It's not just shares from the field. It can incorporate another agency or a safety-oriented organization that maybe has a Twitter handle or an RSS feed or a REST API. But basically the pattern is this. Let's use Twitter as the example. We monitor certain Twitter handles and hashtags. We then save that to SharePoint. And typically, because it's a feed and I don't need too many of them, the flow will also get rid of older ones so that we don't overload the feed. And this basic pattern works for all of them. And then the user, the administrator of this solution, in all of these lists, there is a column that allows them to decide whether it goes to the feed. So information from other third-party sources are actually vetted before they go to, they're consumed by everyone. And so this is just incorporated into the search engine and REST API that I described earlier. So I am running out of time now, so let's just switch tack and talk about a few strategic considerations from implementing a project like this at scale. First one, I would suggest you need to treat this whole thing like a startup. What I mean with a startup is startups usually have, very few resources, and if they make errors of assumption, they're finished because they don't have a lot of capital to begin with. So they have to be very careful about their assumptions. So too with PowerApps, Flow, and the Power Tools. You want to make sure what is the most fundamental assumption we are testing here. And if it's saving time or improving some sort of process efficiency, then ask yourself, what's the minimum I can do to prove that? That way, you're always focusing on value and you're not getting too caught up in making it look pretty or adding features that don't necessarily contribute to that core value proposition. And that's actually what the term minimum viable product really means. It does not mean beta. It does not mean a rough cut version. It means, have you proven what you set out to prove? And if you can do that with a very basic app with a few buttons and not too much branding, that is the way to go. The other one is related to this: treat users as co-creators. Because they are the ones most impacted by the issue, you need to walk in their shoes. So rather than assume that you know what users want, it's the age-old thing. Go out and actually walk in their shoes. I do a lot of apps in the safety space, in industrial scenarios, and most people are wearing safety gear and gloves. And so certain color combinations don't work. If you're wearing gloves on a small phone, don't even think about using option buttons. It has to be big and blocky. That's not immediately obvious to designers unless they walk in the shoes of the users and see the overall environment that the user's working in. This one is important to me. I think it's really important to share patterns and good practices to the community. These tools are citizen developer tools. Don't forget that. They are actually designed for not necessarily IT or not necessarily super technical users. So if you come up with patterns and approaches that work really well, share them so that others can benefit and we can further foster the innovation and use of these tools. One last thing for you, maybe a bit of a meta theme if you like. This is advice to IT departments in general, and if you're a CIO watching this one is for you. You need to learn to tolerate rapid change. Now, back in the day, organizations used to complain to Microsoft it was such a big effort to implement a SharePoint upgrade, say 2010 to 2013, that global enterprises were just skipping upgrades because of the cost and complexity. Well, that problem has been solved. The industry asked Microsoft to solve it, and now we have the other side of it where you have rapid change. I know for a fact that the PowerApps and the Flow team have 3 to 4 week release cycles, so that there are new features coming out very rapidly. This has implications for how you train, for example. This has implications on all sorts of things. If you think you can basically wait for complete certainty, it's just not going to happen. And I only talked PowerApps and Flow here. What about Power BI, Azure Functions, the SharePoint ecosystem? So with that, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this session. I will be on Twitter for any questions and looking forward to your feedback. And thanks very much, folks. Have a good one.